Well, thank you, Millie, for the announcements and Scott for that opening prayer. And tonight we'll be talking about the book by Francis Schaeffer, A Christian Manifesto. And honestly, I cannot imagine a more relevant book for what we're living through today in America than this book. It is absolutely timeless, unfortunately. And but
Jeffrey, we have no audio. At least I don't.
Sorry.
Yeah, now I can hear it. Thank you.
No. Can't hear, Jeffrey.
Jeffrey, we don't have any audio.
Unmute. There's probably a button we can press.
can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
No idea, guys.
Yeah.
I think you were muted.
No.
Well, it was not showing up muted on my screen, but anyway, thanks again for letting us know. All right, so if your schedule allows, tomorrow night, join us at Mount Bethel Church to hear Dr. John West as he talks about why so many pastors and other church, quote, leaders are so afraid to address the great cultural, social, moral, spiritual crises of our time. And his is a very powerful book. He takes no prisoners whatsoever. He names names. And some of the foremost leaders in evangelicalism today, and I use that term very loosely, leaders, are some of the main ones who are refusing to deal honestly and directly with some of the greatest challenges of our time. So I know you will benefit greatly if you can join us tomorrow night. So with that, very much looking forward to Dan's presentation tonight. And there's no one who I admire anymore as a source of great knowledge and wisdom and humility as Dan Siegel. So Dan, here you go. Nice having you with us.
Well, I appreciate that. Should I know where this mute signifier is on here? So if it blows up, I'll know. All right. Thank you much. Greetings. So if that does something, okay. Greetings, everyone. We have some storied names here on our Zoom. Thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you all here in the room for joining us. And I should say up front that unlike Jeffrey, I'm not a historian, I'm not a scholar or an academic. So allowing me to speak to you tonight may be one of his periodic lapses in judgment. I deliver auto parts for a living. Okay, so I never finished college. I do read from a variety of sources. But I remain woefully ignorant of quite a lot. If you think of any expertise I have as quite limited, like a shaft of light coming diagonally across a darkened room. So if you're really interested what's going on in the carpeting in that corner, I can tell you all about it. But the rest of the room, forget it. So seriously, one time a friend happened to ask me the meaning of a word, and it just happened to be a word that I had previously, and the only word that I've ever done this, but it just so happened that a couple years prior, I had actually memorized the dictionary definition of that exact word. And so when I rattled it off verbatim, he thought I was some sort of genius or prodigy, but he didn't know that he just happened to pull the only card out of my mental Rolodex, and the rest of it was empty. So that sums up my whole intellectual approach. With that out of the way, let us now begin. We could do, for the overall theme of Schaeffer's book, which again is a Christian Manifesto published in 1981. For the overall theme, we can do a lot worse than William F. Buckley, who in his own famous book, God and Man at Yale, which I think I'm holding up correctly, he says, quote, "The duel between Christianity and atheism is the most important in the world." And of course, he wrote this in 1951 or thereabouts. So he knew whereover he spoke relative to the communism and the Cold War and these intellectual and social things. I have a slightly long introduction, so please bear with me as I get us going. We will finish on time. Everything's going to be great. I may ask that longer questions wait till the end. If somebody has a brief comment, just wave your arms and jump up and down or something and throw things at me. But a P.J. O'Rourke book, the late commentator and comedian, humorist person, he boasts that one of his books boasts that he, quote, reads Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations so you don't have to. And so that's what I'm doing tonight, is bringing you the best bits of Francis Schaeffer's A Christian Manifesto. Schaeffer mentions at the very beginning, there's a listing of previous manifestos like the Communist Manifesto and the Humanist Manifestos, both the first one in 1933 and a later one, about 1970. There was a third one in the 90s, I want to say. But yeah, a manifesto is any sort of declaration where you lay out your principles and things. So for example, here is an eco-pragmatist manifesto. So you can have any number of manifestos if you wanted, but I should say that Schaeffer's A Christian Manifesto is a very American book. Of course, Schaeffer at the time of writing had just spent almost 3 decades in Switzerland. So this is not, he's not being narrow or parochial. And he does point to things. Hello, Margarita. Geez. Margarita's maybe so. So Schaeffer does point to things that are true in all times and places for all people, and yet the specific application he is making, he's offering us, is to the United States. So perhaps it could have been better titled An American Christian Manifesto or A Christian Manifesto for Americans. It's also kind of a Presbyterian book for reasons we shall see, but as Schaeffer was Presbyterian, this is we can't complain. There's an Atlanta connection to the book. It was published, the book itself says that it states that it was published in association with NIMS Communications. The book was somewhat of a collaboration with Atlantan Jerry Nims, who brought us the Nimslow 3D camera. You may remember it from the early 1980s. Schaeffer writes, "How should we then live?" which Don, of course, wonderfully spoke on last week. Schaeffer writes, "How should we then live?" dealt with the area of history and with the shifts that have come in society, government, and law. Whatever Happened to the Human Race, written and filmed with Dr. C. Everett Koop, dealt with how modern arbitrary law and modern and humanistic medicine have met at the crucial point of human life. That led to the demand of the next logical step. What is the Christian's relationship to government, law, and even civil disobedience? At that point, Jerry Nims, who with his family had come to study in L'Abri, began to ask penetrating questions concerning these things. We had long talks, and he urged me to put my answers into written form. Without that impetus, there would have been no book. Now, subsequently, Mr. Nims had uneven success with his cameras, but continued thinking about the relationship of the Christian to both God and government. To the point that eventually Jerry Falwell turned his moral majority organization over to Jerry Nims to run about 1987, and you can still find an old C-SPAN video online of Mr. Nims speaking in that role from the period. Now, Jeffrey, of course, stated that Jeffrey, of course, stated that the book is timeless, and it does address timeless principles. But in some ways, it's a dated book in that it reflects the realities of 1981. But I say that's a good thing that it's dated, that these conditions no longer prevail. In some respects, obviously, the society and culture have sunk worse and worse and accelerated. But in other respects, things have improved. In the decades since the book was published, our convulsing culture and putrefying politics involving multiple presidential administrations, Congresses, and courts have offered us temptations to despair, to view America and the West in apocalyptic terms, as Schaeffer often seems to here. And indeed, I do not think we are out of the woods yet, to put it mildly. But in substantial part due to Schaeffer's own work, his books, his films, his influence on other evangelicals, things are different now. Since 1981, we have seen the spread of more conservative ideas generally, and specifically their spread into a previously apolitical or left-leaning church. An explosion of books, magazines, talk radio, and then later websites and blogs, the rise of social media, 1,000 things. Thankfully, we are no longer just stuck with, dependent upon one very carefully crafted narrative, generally common to ABC, CBS, NBC, PBS, NPR, the New York Times, the Washington Post, Time, and Newsweek. My favorite, this is not part of my talk, but one of my favorite media stories of 2010 was that this was a year in which you could buy a copy of Newsweek for $4.95, but yet Newsweek sold for $1. The whole company sold for $1 in the same year that you could buy a copy of the magazine for $5. The whole company sold. This is how legacy media has suffered. And we have seen the rise of a vibrant Christian conservatism, first known as the religious right, find its increasingly literate, intelligent voice. And you see hip places like the Babylon Bee, that we didn't have anything like that in 1981. The Schaeffer and a very few friends were very much voices in the wilderness. And of course, we've seen the wide scope and reach and growth of the pro-life movement. All right, Ellen, so you've been with us 10 minutes. We're now up to the preface. And this is important. Immediately, Schaeffer insists that this book is, quote, a natural outgrowth of his previous works. Now, there's a lot of meaning loaded into that one phrase, because one particular criticism of Schaeffer has been trailing him for more than 40 years now, including from his own son. Schaeffer was and still is accused of abandoning his cultural and intellectual interests to hang out with dubious televangelists pursuing power politics. Professor Ronald Wells, who wrote for the Reformed Journal, I believe it was, he writes, I was very disappointed to see in the late 1970s and early 1980s his shifts of emphasis from intellectual history, philosophy, and theology to a focus on contemporary American social and political issues. Many of us who were with him in the early years could not grasp why his later efforts had descended to bombastic essays that gave intellectual firepower to the then new Christian right. And of course, he has it in quotes. Books like Whatever Happened to the Human Race, and especially The Great Evangelical Disaster, were embarrassingly different from his earlier works. How did the intellectual hero of our generation move to be a person embraced by the likes of Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, James Dobson, D. James Kennedy, and Randall Terry, who founded Operation Rescue? But I'm personally, just speaking for myself, I'm grateful that God let Dr. Schaeffer live just long enough to rebut these criticisms, which were cropping up in the early 80s. And of course, Schaeffer died in about May of 1984 or thereabouts. So Schaeffer gets to write on this very critique, and he says, this criticism, however, really is not accurate. A more correct way to look at my work would be to see a continuity from beginning to end. My earlier books dealt especially with intellectual matters in the area of culture. Then there were the books dealing with the Christian life and the church. My later books have made specific application of my earlier work to the area of law and to the society as a whole, especially in relation to the crucial issues of human life and freedom of religious expression. Now, was the brand new early 1980s religious right, which had been hastily cobbled together from concerned evangelicals, Catholics, Jews, and even Mormons, to fight for the right to life and cultural sanity, was it always highly thoughtful, intellectual, and sensitive? No. But Schaeffer wasn't going to let us get away with lazily dismissing the whole effort on that basis. Schaeffer wrote, regardless of whether we think the moral majority, which was one prominent organization of that period, regardless of whether we think the moral majority has always said the right things, or whether we do not, or whether we think they have made some mistakes, or whether we do not, they have certainly done one thing right. They have used the freedom we still have in the political arena to stand against the other total entity, by which Schaeffer means secular humanism. Schaeffer goes on, they have carried the fact that law is king, law is above the lawmakers, and God is above the law into this area of life where it always should have been. And this is part of true spirituality. Schaeffer tells us that the moral majority has drawn a line between the one total view of reality, and we're coming to that, and the other total view of reality and the results this brings forth in government and law. And if you personally do not like some of the details of what they have done, do it better. But you must understand that all Christians have got to do the same kind of thing, or you are simply not showing the lordship of Christ in the totality of life. Schaeffer's son Frank has a slightly, he has that critique, but he has others, and one of them is, Frank, of course, Frankie, originally he was Frankie, and in recent years he goes by Frank. Anybody wants my talk on Frankie from a few years ago, happy to send you the email. Frank says, quote, I believe that my parents' call to the ministry actually drove them crazy. They were happiest when farthest away from their missionary work, wandering the back streets of Florence, or rather when they turned their missionary work into something very unmissionary-like, such as talking about art history instead of Christ. But what I would ask Frank, were he in the room with us or on Zoom, I would say, but what if the Schaeffers came to believe that they had a duty to take on the crisis in America and the West as an act of Christian love, of service to their neighbors? What if it's not about their happiness? Indeed, John Adams, one of America's founding fathers and our second president, famously wrote about the need to do things that really aren't very fun because of our particular place in history. And he even specifically contrasts politics with the arts, saying that, quote, I must study politics and war so that our sons may have liberty to study mathematics and philosophy. Our sons ought to study mathematics and philosophy, geography, natural history and naval architecture, navigation, commerce, and agriculture in order to give their children a right to study painting, poetry, music, architecture, statuary, tapestry, and porcelain. Okay, we're now at chapter 1. Schaeffer says that part of our great tragedy is that we Christians for much too long had only been seeing things in bits and pieces instead of totals, as our whole societal consensus shifted from one vaguely Christian to one of impersonal matter, energy, and chance. These contrasting outlooks, Schaeffer says, inevitably produce different results in society, government, and law. Inevitably. How different? The writer and commentator Joseph Bottom, although Catholic himself, writes very fondly of the moral cultural consensus that once prevailed in America, shaped by the Protestant churches, the major denominations. In his book, An Anxious Age, which I'm holding up for our friends on Zoom, you got to feel bad for the guy. I used to read him in various magazines. Jay Bottom wrote for the Weekly Standard and First Things. He was actually an assistant to Richard John Newhouse at First Things, and even took over editorship of the magazine for about a year. And made it much hipper and more lively, and that wasn't really what the people at the Institute for Religion and Society really wanted. So anyway, but I have to feel really bad for him for this book, because this is like a $30 hardback book. And where did I find my copy? It's one thing if you get remaindered at Books A Million or something. No, I found my copy at Dollar Tree. So yes, $1 I get a $30 book. So poor Jay Bottom. But anyway. But Jay Bottom writes that Protestantism gave Americans a code of manners, a state of mind, a mode of being, a political foundation, a national definition. Bottom tells us that together these churches, they formed a vague but vast unity. Together, they formed America. In truth, he says, all the talk from the 18th century on of the United States as a religious nation was really just a make-nice way of saying it was a Christian nation. And even to call it a Christian nation was usually just a soft and ecumenical attempt to gloss over the obvious fact that the United States was, at its root, a Protestant nation. He goes on, the general conflux of the major Protestant denominations remained for nearly 300 years a great river at the heart of American public life. It was a messy thing, true enough, meandering in enormous loops and switchbacks, changing course from time to time, rising and falling. Nevertheless, everyone knew that Protestantism for what it was, our cultural Mississippi rolling through the center of the American landscape. Beyond all their differences, he says, the diverse Protestant churches merged to give a general form and a general tone to the culture. Protestantism helped define the nation, operating as simultaneously the happy enabler and the unhappy conscience of the American Republic, a single source for both national comfort and national unease. Bottom says that the mainline Protestant denominations may have been, quote, an intellectually emaciated form of Christendom, as Catholic writers tended to insist, but it was all the Christendom we had in America. And it offered us a vocabulary with which both to criticize the nation and to support it. So whether it was Dr. King or what am I trying to think of, prohibition or anything else, any moral crusade, whether worthy or unworthy, was rooted in understandings that all Americans had and would recognize, even if they didn't believe in themselves. People who didn't really believe in Jesus would still go and get married. They didn't necessarily just hook up. So mainline Protestantism gave us a vague but vast unity that stood outside of politics and economics, and it kept us more or less whole as a people, even at our most divided. So what is this alternative that Schaeffer says was foisted upon us by the courts and academia and the media and Hollywood? Schaeffer talked about this matter and energy and chance. What is this alternative view to this Christian consensus that we substantially had? What does that look like? What are the social political results of believing that everything is just impersonal matter and or energy shaped by chance? Well, U.S. Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes held that, quote, truth was the majority vote of that nation that could lick all others. Justice Holmes said that, quote, my bet is that we have not the kind of cosmic importance that the parsons and philosophers teach. I doubt if a shudder would go through the spheres if the whole ant heap were kerosened. You get that? If the planet is incinerated, there isn't anyone left to care. No God, for instance. Holmes also said that, quote, I think the sacredness of human life is a purely municipal ideal of no validity outside the jurisdiction. In other words, humans think that humans are special. So this just speciesism is all we've got, right? Cats probably think cats are special, and isn't that nice, right? That's Justice Holmes. Holmes also said, quote, I see no reason for attributing to a man a significance different in kind from that which belongs to a baboon or to a grain of sand. Indeed, new atheist Richard Dawkins tells us that, quote, the universe that we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pitiless indifference. This battle for the soul, the mind of America and the West, is not a parlor game. As Richard Weaver reminded us, ideas have consequences. Aldous Huxley candidly admitted that, quote, I had motives for not wanting the world to have a meaning, and consequently assumed that it had none, and was able without any difficulty to find satisfying reasons for this assumption. The philosopher who finds no meaning in the world is not concerned exclusively with a problem in pure metaphysics. He is also concerned to prove that there is no valid reason why he personally should not do as he wants to do. For myself, as no doubt for most of my friends, the philosophy of meaninglessness was essentially an instrument of liberation from a certain system of morality. We objected to the morality because it interfered with our sexual freedom. The supporters of this system claimed that it embodied the meaning, the Christian meaning, they insisted, of the world. There is one admirably simple method of confuting these people and justifying ourselves in our erotic revolt. We would deny that the world had any meaning whatsoever. Schaeffer asks, so how did we miss this shift? And of course, he's going to tell us, as Jeffrey often reminds us, that our, and I'm not speaking for those in this room who are pretty sharp people, but our meaning evangelicals, Christians, people of faith in the United States over the 20th century, our Christianity was inadequate. It was defective. It was pietistic. For true spirituality, see Schaeffer's book by that title, covers all of life, all of reality. Again, as Jeffrey often reminds us. So the two views, the theistic and specifically Christian biblical view, over against the secular humanist view that man is the measure of all things, autonomous, accountable to no one, These two views are, as Schaeffer says, just inevitably going to produce different results in society, in culture, in law, in government. Because humanism produces moral chaos, Schaeffer argues for the Reformation's understandings, including sola scriptura, as ultimately the proper ultimate basis for society and law. But even short of that, as Jeffrey points out in his work on natural law, we can see that there are things about reality that even the unbeliever cannot fail to know, to which we can appeal. We don't have to convert our entire society to Christ before we can begin to articulate and promote a wholesome agenda aimed at human flourishing. Any thoughts before we hit chapter 2? Yes, Jeff.
Oliver Wendell Holmes is hardly remembered anymore. But you know, when you think about his influence, I'm not sure that there was anybody else in the 1800s that might have had as much influence, driving America toward a more secular, humanistic worldview perspective than Oliver Wendell Holmes. Can you think of anybody who
He was
might
the
have been
he was
more influential?
he was the well, John Dewey in education came later. Right. Yeah. In chapter 2, Schaeffer introduces us to the Presbyterian minister John Witherspoon and to Samuel Rutherford, whom Don, who just stepped out for a moment, Don mentioned last week with Rutherford's concept of lex rex, which is law is king, not rex lex, wherein whatever the king says is the law. Just think of it this way. Those in government are themselves under law. They are not autonomous. So that's basically lex rex in a nutshell. And Schaeffer calls our attention to the contributions of John Locke. I'm not competent to gauge the relative importance of these three men in the American founding, but we do have the hilarious contemporary quote from the Prime Minister of England, Horace Walpole, who, when upon hearing the news of colonial rebellion, reportedly said, "Us in America has run off with a Presbyterian parson." Because it was these Presbyterian doctrines, this Presbyterian thinking that led to these conclusions. Anyway, the ultimate result, the philosophical conclusion is, as we see in the Declaration, and this took some decades to get there, unalienable rights endowed by the Creator. For if the government gives rights, it can take them away just as easily. Indeed, President John F. Kennedy, in his own inaugural address, said, "The rights of man come not from the generosity of the state, but from the hand of God." This is the understanding. And Schaeffer points out that the founding generation was very friendly to religion with prayer, Thanksgiving Day. They even had state churches for a time. Thus, the more radical and more recent separation doctrine, separation of church and states, what that means, what that was later taken to mean, cannot, per Schaeffer, be taken to mean a purely secular state. But come on, relax. No one is trying to get rid of the free exercise of religion, are they? I mean, they can't just wave away the U.S. Constitution, right? Well, here's President Obama's chairman of the United States Commission on, yes, the United States Commission on Civil Rights. This is the chairman, Martin Castro, and you might put other names ending with Castro in this quote. And when you hear what he has to say, and what Martin Castro tells us is that, quote, "The phrases religious liberty and religious freedom will stand for nothing except hypocrisy so long as they remain code words for discrimination, intolerance, racism, sexism, homophobia, Islamophobia, Christian supremacy, or any form of intolerance. Today, as in the past, religion is being used as both a weapon and a shield by those seeking to deny others equality." So you think, well, it's written down in the Constitution. They can't close my church. They can't jail my friends. Gotta watch these folks. And both President Obama and Secretary Clinton frequently use the phrase freedom of worship. I mean, here in this room and on Zoom, we're all for freedom of worship, right? Nothing ominous about freedom of worship. I'm sure I'm being paranoid, except that we can observe that freedom of worship, that worship is something you can do in your head. Even the people languishing in China's Laogai system of gulag prisons, they have freedom of worship. So freedom of worship is not that earth-shaking. Whereas constitutional free exercise of religion means you get to build churches, hold services, hire and fire clergy, print and distribute books, pamphlets, recordings of religious music. That's what we were facing was this sort of watering down what we have as the constitutional, our legally protected rights. And now it is all gone. With these striking words, Schaeffer opens chapter 3. pointing to our secularized society with its secularized law. His argument is that secularism militates against religious liberty and even all liberty because it recognizes no higher law. Instead, we just get the pragmatic decisions of legislators, or worse, the homemade law of unelected bureaucrats. And starting about 90 years ago, Schaeffer doesn't go into this, but starting about 90 years ago, and you can check the Wikipedia entry for this, starting about 90 years ago, we got the concept of the so-called living constitution, which is a school of interpretation where the Constitution can be then endlessly and freely reinterpreted, flexibly bent like rubber as needed to accommodate the latest desires of the population, as these are discerned by people in government. And of course, those pushing a more flexible, freewheeling scheme of interpretation will point to ever-changing circumstances. But these are precisely why the framers gave us a lawful process and procedure of amendment. You don't just go to the court and go, well, you know, the people need this, so we're just going to move some stuff around. Like, I've never sat down and read the entire Obergefell decision from 2015, but I have read people who have read it, and they tell me that it doesn't even quote from the Constitution. It's like, that's quite around the bend there. And Schaeffer is right that Schaeffer is right that the courts, and notably the Supreme Court, have imposed humanistic conclusions about human nature onto the law that Congress or state legislatures would not have arrived at. In this respect, these were anti-democratic. But, and this is me talking, we must ask, what if they weren't the result of raw judicial power? What if the same legal result was arrived at democratically? Yes, Roe v. Wade, which declared a constitutional right to abortion, took away the right of legislatures in all 50 states to ban abortion. But with the Dobbs decision in 2022, this power was restored by the High Court. So since Dobbs, some states have made it more difficult to get an abortion. Some states have made it easier. And some people think this is all just fine. This is an example of democracy at work. But wait, is that the end of it for the Christian? Just leave it up to the voters? Is that what we did with the evil of chattel slavery? Do your neighbors get to vote you into a wood chipper? There are meant to be limits, and this is still me talking. There are meant to be limits, I think Schaeffer would agree, but there are meant to be limits to democracy. Elections are not supposed to be the equivalent of two wolves and a sheep voting on what to do for dinner. Our basic rights, and first and foremost our right to life, were not intended to be subject to the opinions of other people. Our rights to life, liberty, or property are not subject to a legislative, judicial, or popular veto. We have these rights even if our neighbors don't happen to like us. Now, at the time Schaeffer wrote, yes, the courts were already lurching toward the secular denial of unalienable rights, much further towards that than were the American people. And so we can agree with Schaeffer that the courts often imposed illegitimate decisions undemocratically. But the thinking of the American people themselves has deteriorated since then. People in many states like abortion. They see it as a positive good. Same-sex marriage, quote unquote, was wildly controversial until recently. President Obama, he ran for president opposing it. So we may now need, and this is still me talking, we may now need a determined vocal minority, ourselves, to push to elect those who will appoint judges to, yes, somewhat flout the opinions of our neighbors and undemocratically impose constitutional decisions affirming legitimate rights that the current version of the voting public might or might not recognize. But y'all didn't come here to hear from me exactly. You came to hear from Schaeffer and friends. So chapter 4, John West, who dedicated his recent book, Stockholm Syndrome Christianity, to Francis Schaeffer, writes in it that, quote, those of us who are Christians often regard atheists, agnostics, and secularists as the prime movers of America's cultural collapse. Without question, they have helped spur our country's descent into chaos, anger, loneliness, and despair. But we need to face an uncomfortable truth. Christians who aid, abet, and even encourage the rejection of historic Christian teachings are also playing a key role in our disintegration. And indeed, in chapter 4, Schaeffer tells us that our culture, society, government, and law are in the condition they are in, not because of some conspiracy, but because the church has forgotten its duty to be the salt of the culture. But Schaeffer does talk about the claims made in the humanist manifestos, and that these ideas, again, without a conscious conspiracy, are widely held by members of the media. And so he warns us that the media's ability to change our perception of any event raises serious questions concerning the democratic process. In chapter 5, Schaeffer continues his critique of evangelical leaders. He says they forgot their own heritage, that the great revivals of the past led almost immediately to things like schools, orphanages, and aspects of social reform. But now, that is in 1981, when Schaeffer is writing, that now they often don't seem to want to hear about abortion, infanticide, euthanasia, and the unique dignity and worth of all human beings. Schaeffer again mostly chalks this up to their Platonic, otherworldly spirituality, a Christianity that, quoting his son, Frankie, has become, quote, a waffling spiritual goo. And again, Frankie was once very, very good and did heroic work. And again, if anybody wants to see my talk on that, check afterwards and I'll send you the email. Anybody need a break? Everybody cool? Questions, comments? Not you. Go on. Go on. Sorry, Jeffrey. No, please please tell me.
Wrote about Frankie in our book, wrote Legacy, Frank and Schaeffer and so on. You devoted a chapter basically.
Yeah, in the appendix
Yeah.
in the appendix to Jeffrey's book, I wrote a little bit on the long, strange trip of Frankie Schaeffer. And
devolution, his spiritual devolution.
yes, and his political migration from right to left. And also, I also did present a 30-minute talk with Q&A and stuff, and I can send you the link to that, anybody interested. In chapter 6, Schaeffer really goes to town. There is a lot here. He says that with the conservative turn in the country, and this is again 1981, Reagan was just inaugurated January 1981, and he's writing this, that's contemporaneous with that. So you would think, oh, okay, well, Reagan's elected, we're good, we're safe, our rights are secured, everything's going to be great. Well, Schaeffer says that with the conservative turn in the country, we do have an open window, an opportunity, freedom in which to work. But he insists our challenge is not merely that of meaningfully securing the right to life, as important as that is. No, we must try to roll back the other total entity. That is, we must somehow address the overwhelming and wholly false secular consensus. But, Schaeffer asks, what if our window of opportunity does not stay open? What then? And a lot of the rest of the book, the succeeding chapters, are not about all the glorious things we can do with American freedom, but what happens if we lose a lot of our American freedom? How do we live in this as a persecuted minority? What steps could we take, or what steps must we take with a hostile government? In my talk on Schaeffer, one of my talks, I mentioned Aaron Renn, who's a Christian author currently, and he wrote a book called Life in the Negative World, and he marks out this time spans, and you can argue with his time spans, but he talks about up to a certain point, like 1994, that Americans as a whole had a positive opinion about Christians and Christianity, and then we went to this neutral world up until maybe 2010, 2015 or something, and then things have hardened since then into negative world where you're considered kind of a bad person if you're a Christian, and so. So Schaeffer is looking ahead to such times like that and going, okay, if we have this manipulative authoritarian government, what do we as Christians do, and how far down the line can we obey that government? That's where the meat of the book really is. So Schaeffer asks, what if our window of opportunity does not stay open? What then? He notes first that the hippies and others in the 1960s counterculture eventually gave up on their utopian hopes and dreams and joined the system for its material benefits. Then immediately Schaeffer alludes to the so-called silent majority. As new left radicals were taking over college campuses in the late 60s, accompanied by riots and left-wing terrorist bombing campaigns in major cities, President Nixon dusted off an older phrase, quote, the silent majority, unquote, to refer to generally conservative middle Americans who were actually not on the barricades, who didn't shout their political opinions. These were mostly older people, not the boomers, but the World War II greatest generation, who didn't march in the streets, didn't set off bombs to make their point. Instead, they quietly voted for a certain normalcy. But Schaeffer argues first that most of these were not conservative out of principle. They simply valued their own personal peace and affluence. And secondly, he points out that these former hippies who gave up and joined the systems have the same bankrupt values of personal peace and affluence. And without using unfortunate terms like yuppie or bobo, Schaeffer notes that we were already in 1981 seeing many people who were economically conservative yet socially very liberal. And of course, as boomers further pursued their careers, this phenomenon came to fuller fruition in the Clinton years. So Schaeffer asked, was the recent Reagan election about conservatism, or did it just represent the hope that his economic policies would bear fruit for people who were, again, socially and morally liberal? Now, historically, we know that better economic numbers were indeed forthcoming, that the 1980s soon became a prosperous time. But in 1981, Schaeffer can't look ahead, so he wonders what authoritarian measures will follow if the economy does not improve. What will the government have to do? Will they have, food rationing? What's coming if things are tough and stay tough? And so Schaeffer passes along to us no fewer than 31 church-state conflicts or potential conflicts that might not go our way if political power is given over to a technocratic elite. And indeed, he notes that the courts already function as such an elite. Now, this is me speaking again, here I might offer that whatever you think or feel about various deep state conspiracy theories, we as Christians in America already lack any kind of philosophical or theological response to or theory about the technocracy that we already have. Never mind any rogue elements rooted deep within existing government agencies. What about these agencies themselves? And Scott and I have talked a little bit about this. Leaving aside agencies like the IRS and FBI that are entrusted with various forms of armament, the FBI, that's their big status thing. We're packing, other agencies, they're not packing, but we're packing, we carry guns. Leaving aside the controversial ones, what about the more ordinary government agencies, the TVA, the FAA, the FCC, and so on? How do these relate to our system of democratic governance? These can take on a life of their own, issuing directives, writing regulations without you voting for or against any of it. And I'm not saying, I'm not even making a statement about this is bad, this is good. I'm just saying we don't have a theology or a philosophy as Christian Americans about that. We see the power lines go by and we see the big dams and we see all the planes flying overhead without pieces of them falling off on our heads. And so there's smart people that are taking care of all this stuff, but they're not the people that we vote for at the voting booth. There's these other people, and what are they doing and how are they doing it? And are they doing it well? Or are they doing it badly? They're not consulting us. That's all I'm saying, is that this takes place on this totally other plane, so to speak. Finally, Schaeffer alludes to Jeremiah 12:5, which reads, "If you have raced with men on foot and they have worn you out, how can you compete with horses?" And Schaeffer asks, should not all of us be thinking what to do about it if the window does shut? The Christian theologians, the educators, the lawyers, the evangelical leadership have not had a very good record in the past of seeing things as a whole. That is, they have not seen the contrast between the consensus, which is based on there being a lawgiver and what that naturally brings forth, and the totally different material energy chance worldview of reality and what that naturally brings forth. Now, if we have not run very well in the past with the footmen, when it has been so very easy, I wonder what is going to happen to us if we have to run with the horsemen. What will protect us from what is happening in most of the world today? And in 1981, communism, the Soviet Union was still very much on the march. They were still quite busy in Afghanistan and Angola and all kinds of places around the world. Have we run with the footmen, Schaeffer asks? Very, very poorly. What happens if we must run with the horsemen? And now the fun part. Chapters 7, 8, and 9, I'm going to hit together as they address the same basic question. What duties does the citizen, the Christian, have? What are the limits of legitimate government authority, if any, if there is such a thing as tyranny? I'm not saying that government authority has no issue. Sorry, I misquoted myself here. I'm not implying that the government has no legitimacy. I'm saying what are the limits, if any, to legitimate government authority? I stated my own sentence improperly. And what about civil disobedience? What form might that legitimately take? Schaeffer allows that the Christian is to obey the state, but immediately qualifies that by asking, has God therefore set up an authority in the state that is autonomous from himself? For example, if the government says that we must all agree that the sky is green, or says that it's innocents who should be killed and the guilty go free, how far are we obligated to go along with that? Schaeffer views the government's authority as having been, and you'll see this in Jeffrey's notes, Schaeffer views the government's authority as having been delegated to it by God to accomplish his purposes. But over and over, he argues that if government acts against those purposes, it forfeits a certain amount of its legitimacy, such that disobeying the government in certain situations may well be our Christian duty. And Schaeffer sees precedents for this stance And obviously we could think of the Egyptian, what were the midwives or whatever who rescued Moses, you know, they said, oh, well, we found this guy in a basket and he was going downstream and, you know, right. They lied. They disobeyed the government. But Schaeffer sees precedents for this stance of civil disobedience in the New Testament. He sees civil disobedience in the Christian martyrs, arguing, and this is an interesting argument Schaeffer makes, and I've never seen anybody else make this argument, but it tracks with me. He argues that many were not put to death by the Roman Empire for believing in Jesus because you could believe in anything, but they refused to agree with the proposition that Caesar is Lord. So they were, from the Christian point of view, oh, well, this is this big theological line we can't cross. But from the Roman point of view, you're civil rebels. You're saying, get lost, government. We're going to do this our way, right? And so from the Roman point of view, they were rebels. Schaeffer goes on to give other examples on the theory and practice of civil disobedience from various Protestant heroes, William Tyndale, John Bunyan, Martin Luther, and gives considerable attention to John Knox, I told you it was Presbyterian, who articulated a theory of resistance and revolution, planting seeds, Schaeffer said, later watered by Samuel Rutherford and others, leading ultimately to the American Revolution. But, says Schaeffer, civil disobedience is a serious matter and offers us two contrasting approaches of Rutherford. So Rutherford says distinguishes what the individual should do versus the corporate body. So the individual, Rutherford says, if you're confronted by tyranny or the illegitimate use of force by a government, the individual is to protest, and if that fails, to flee to safety, and then finally the person may use force to defend themselves. But Rutherford points out that a corporate body, a local government, or a church, it can't flee. So he authorizes first protest and then goes straight to the physical resistance. How much resistance? Well, first, Schaeffer argues that if our taxes go to pay for abortion, we might go as far as a tax protest, withholding our taxes. Of course, there will be consequences. Jeffrey here has expressed doubts that the rule of King George III was genuinely so bad as to justify or authorize the American Revolution. But Schaeffer, for his part, offers that the colonists had come to see the British as a foreign power and themselves defending their colonies. Now, I'm not taking a stand either way on that. Some of my friends believe this and some of my friends believe that, and I stand with my friends. Now, Schaeffer does stand accused of holding radical anti-government views. His son, we've talked about, Frank Schaeffer, when interviewed for God in America, a PBS series, said that, and I'll try to sound as angry as Frank often does, Dad wrote a book at the very end of his life in which he said that should democratic nonviolent means fail to bring America back to God on the issue of abortion, that first, civil disobedience should be tried, and secondly, if need be, a revolution cast in the mold of the first American Revolution. And yes, that would include force against the government. He compared America to Nazi Germany. What's so ironic is here you had a guy who's having lunch with the president calling for the overthrow of the U.S. government, and he just gets invited for afternoon tea. No one says a word. Again, this is Frankie describing Francis. Francis Schaeffer, this is still Frankie. Francis Schaeffer, friend of Ronald Reagan, friend of the Bush family, friend of Gerald Ford, confidant of Jack Kemp, guest in the Kemp's home, Schaeffer Bible study with the Doles and the Kemps and everybody coming. This guy's running around printing a book comparing America to Nazi Germany and says that if all else fails, violent revolution is the godly way to go. That's the kind of margin where the religious right went, says Frankie. So when you see the current debates on right-wing politics, when you've got these loonies showing up at meetings, carried loaded weapons with signs saying, the tree of liberty is watered with the blood of tyrants, there's a good chance that some of these guys read a Christian manifesto at some point in their lives. Now, of course, my view is that, as usual, Frank is just a little bit excitable here. Our man Francis doesn't quite say in the book what his son charges him with. In fact, jumping ahead, Schaeffer actually begins chapter 10 by expressing some personal bafflement, saying he is actually not sure what all this means in practice at the present moment. Schaeffer says this himself. He's like, let's talk about it. Let's think about it. But yes, the hard stuff hits in chapter 9. Schaeffer does allow that there does come a time when physical force in a defensive posture is appropriate. Yet even when discussing Nazi Germany, which Schaeffer regards as a false and counterfeit state, Schaeffer's radical proposal for the true Christian living at that time is merely to hide your Jewish neighbors from the SS, which of course isn't violent at all. This is his big radical proposal. You're surrounded by Nazis, and what do? Well, honey, we got some room in the attic. That's his big violent overthrow of the government. For governments today funding abortion, he says we should apply political force. If this fails, he says we might initiate lawsuits. So far, I'm not seeing looting and burning. So far, I'm not seeing an overthrow of an insurrection. Schaeffer approvingly discusses some seminary students at what's it called? St. Louis, the famous Covenant Theological Seminary. He discusses approvingly some students who were arrested in St. Louis for picketing at an abortion clinic. Well, of course, picketing clinics under normal circumstances was legal at the time, so I'm not sure for what precisely was the action of these students. Perhaps they were peacefully, non-violently blocking the entrance to the clinic in the manner of the later Operation Rescue effort, whose founder said he was inspired by Schaeffer. Ask me later about my Operation Rescue adventure. I knew for a fact that I could not take days and weeks off of work to go lay down in the clinic entrance with the church ladies and be rousted out. You know, the police, they used torture. They didn't call it torture. They called it pain compliance techniques. You know, basically, if you take this lady's hand and you bend it back like this, she'll get up off the sidewalk. She'll get up out of the driveway. If you do this and this and this, yeah, she'll come along with you. So I knew that I couldn't do that. So I said, well, I can still hold a sign, right? It's First Amendment issue advocacy. I can hold a pro-life sign way over there on the sidewalk where it's legal. I'm not blocking the entrance. I'm not blocking the police. I'm not doing anything. Well, after they dragged away all the people to the paddy wagons and took them off to jail, the city of Atlanta police decided they would illegally clear the sidewalk. And so suddenly I'm in the backseat of a police car going downtown without being read my rights or handed a bill of attainder or anything like that. And thankfully, they did not throw me in with the general prison population. They put me in a big rec room at the top of the jail with all the Operation Rescue people, and it was the most golden time of fellowship for 3 whole days until my mom bailed me out of jail. That's a longer story I won't go into, but that was so yeah. I knew I couldn't afford to take off work, and that's things just happen, But anyway, regardless, we see in the case of these students that Schaeffer does not advocate a physical attack on the clinic or its staff, only at most peaceful resistance here. Indeed, he goes on to suggest sit-ins at legislatures and courts if constitutional means ultimately fail. Schaeffer does seem keen to keep before us the idea of a bottom line, that at some point at least, some point in principle, there remains the right and duty to disobey the state. Yet this, he says, is scary, quote unquote, scary for 4 reasons. The first is that Schaeffer wants nothing to do with establishing some Christian theocracy. He writes, and Jeffrey's quoted this before, I think, Schaeffer says, as we stand for religious freedom today, we need to realize that this must include a general religious freedom from the control of the state for all religion. It will not mean just freedom for those who are Christians. It is then up to Christians to show that Christianity is the truth of total reality. Just checking the time here. The total reality, we're good. In the open marketplace of freedom, we must make definite that we are in no way talking about any kind of theocracy. Let me say that with great emphasis, Schaeffer says. Witherspoon, Jefferson, the American founders had no idea of a theocracy. That is made plain by the First Amendment, and we must continually emphasize the fact that we are not talking about some kind or any kind of a theocracy. In the Old Testament, there was a theocracy commanded by God. In the New Testament, with the church being made up of Jews and Gentiles and spreading all over the known world from India to Spain in one generation, the church was its own entity. We must not confuse the kingdom of God with our country. To say it another way, we should not wrap Christianity in our national flag. None of this, however, changes the fact, and this goes back to what Jay Bottom was talking about, none of this, Schaeffer says, changes the fact that the United States was founded upon a Christian consensus, nor that we today should bring Judeo-Christian principles into play in regard to government. But that is very different than a theocracy in name or in fact. Secondly, Schaeffer, again, saying why it's scary to talk about civil disobedience, Schaeffer acknowledges that his book will be read in communist countries, that copies of that book will get overseas and behind the Iron Curtain, and by believers under much harsher regimes, and he doesn't want to guilt them into rash measures. For if they disobey their governments, they don't get a jury of their peers, they get sent to a labor camp in Siberia, if they should live so long. Third, Schaeffer is uneasy about suggesting active resistance to the state because of the evangelical left, because Christians influenced by Marxist liberation theology may misuse his suggestions on the side of oppression, resisting not the unjust policies of a government, but the just ones. Fourth, and this is really interesting, Schaeffer says speaking of civil disobedience is frightening because he freely acknowledges that there are, quote, so many kooky people around, irresponsible people who will, in their unbalanced way, tend to do the very opposite from considering the appropriate means at the appropriate time and place. Anarchy, Schaeffer says, is never appropriate. Well, would you here gathered tonight, would you believe that one of these seemingly irresponsible people is actually named for Francis Schaeffer? Dr. Schaeffer is Francis August Schaeffer IV. Frankie is Francis August Schaeffer V. And yet, tonight, if I can get my phone to work. My phone wants something here from me. 5 seconds. Tell me that's not my phone doing that. Oh, here we go. 5 seconds, y'all. One moment, please. Okay, but I'm not now thinking of Frank, irresponsible though I think he can be at times. No, in 1984, a certain Baptist pastor and his wife named their baby boy after Schaeffer, just months before Francis died, naming him Francis August Schaeffer Cox. Publicly known simply as Schaeffer Cox, he was, according to Wikipedia, founder of an organization called the Alaska Peacemakers Militia. According to Wikipedia, in 2011, Schaeffer Cox was arrested for alleged involvement in a murder conspiracy known as 241, where 2 law enforcement officers were to be killed for each member of the Peacemakers Militia killed in anticipation of government action against Cox and weapons charges, including possession of an unregistered machine gun. After state charges were dismissed, additional federal charges were brought against him, blah, 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 hand grenades, silencers, grenade launcher, etc. At a Montana gathering, this Schaeffer Cox reportedly boasted, "We've got a 3,500 man force, militia force in Fairbanks. It is not a ragtag deal. I mean, we're set. We've got rocket launchers and grenade launchers and claymores and machine guns and cavalry, and we've got boats. It's all set." This, of course, got the attention of the FBI. But even contemplating the danger of just such things as that, our Schaeffer still wanted to insist on the principle that if there is no final place for civil disobedience, then the government has been made autonomous, and as such, it has been put in the place of the living God. We've already seen Schaeffer pleading a certain amount of bafflement at the start of chapter 10, unsure precisely what was the state of affairs, the path forward, what to do at the present time, even with his own advice. So he is indeed keen to at least leave us with overarching principles. Supposedly, a rough guide to public speaking advises that first you tell them what you're going to tell them, then you tell them what you told them. So it is perhaps appropriate that here at the end of the book, Schaeffer indulges in a bit of review, reminding us evangelicals of our collective foolishness. He uses the word foolishness in concentrating on bits and pieces, our failure to face up to the fact that we are confronted with a total worldview rooted in a false view of reality. Quote, one that inevitably brings forth totally different and wrong and inhuman results in all of life, and nowhere is this more certain than in the area of government and law, forcing this false view and its results on everyone. Schaeffer again insists that when any office commands what is contrary to God's law, it abrogates its authority. Schaeffer reminds us that much of the book addresses that possibility that our window of opportunity may close. But of course, it's the year 2025. We know that our window stayed open for the last 44 years. We were perfectly free to write our elected representatives, to lobby, to vote, to run for office ourselves, to begin new tax-exempt organizations, and on and on. After some genuinely difficult moments, we secured the right to homeschool our children. Yet with us having all this abundant freedom of action stretching to the horizon over the decades, how have we done at the task Schaeffer assigned to us to roll back the results of the total worldview which considers material and energy shaped by chance as the final reality? There are bright spots we can point to, but overall I would give us at most a D-. Now, Jeffrey, you're exempt. You created the Areopagus, so you can go back to bed. But it's me I'm worried about. It's the guy I watch shaving every morning. He's the guy I'm troubled about and his life of progress and stuff. But on a cheerier note, Some of those bright spots, some of our genuine accomplishments involve things Schaeffer actually commends to us as Christian alternatives, like starting crisis pregnancy centers, that don't actually involve resisting the government at all beyond a necessary lawsuit here and there. Schaeffer closes by arguing 7 points. One, it was the Reformation base that gave us our American ordered liberty because of a certain balance of form and freedom. Second, subsequent immigrants did not have that Reformation base. They enjoyed freedoms that their own philosophical, theological base would not have produced. Now, Schaeffer doesn't say so here, but I believe that in part he's referring to our Catholic friends who, prior to the Second Vatican Council in the early 60s, didn't really endorse freedom of conscience, holding instead that error has no rights. But it wasn't really Catholics that were the problem in losing things like the right to life. Oh, and I have a message from Orrin and Brenda Harris saying I lost sound. I don't know how to fix that.
You're
It
good.
says audio.
That's
You're
an
good?
old message.
That's an old message. Okay, then I'll hit that little X button. All right. Well, we're good. Okay, folks, welcome back. We'll start over. Hey, I got coffee over here. We got cups. You know, we're good. I'll be here all night, folks. No, we're almost done here. Yeah, but Catholics weren't really the problem. Well, the problem was losing faith in the American charter. Now, it's true some of these Catholics might not have really believed in the American charter in terms of individualism and things like that, but no, a large portion of America lost faith in America, and Lincoln used to make that argument that, look, you know, maybe if people don't care about liberty anymore, I'm just going to go to Russia where you can take despotism pure and not with this alloy of hypocrisy. You know, if you don't want to be bossed around by the government, yeah, I'll go over there. You know, but anyway. And then point 3, Schaeffer does allow that, yes, the big shift in America was the rise of the material energy chance view of reality, bringing its multitude of destructive results. But he notes that the worldview, this is point 4, that the worldview that did produce America is often not allowed influence in government, schools, or the media. You know, so when you read quotes from Aquinas and Augustine in Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail, when he talks about just laws and unjust laws, when you talk about Kennedy, we quoted earlier, talking about rights come from God and not from the state. You start talking like that, they don't give you influence. They won't let you onto their talk shows. They won't let you teach in schools. And so it's like, but this is the view that created America, and yet now it's un-American. So we're in a weird place. Point 5, Schaeffer says, so we must somehow dislodge the hold the destructive humanistic view has upon government and law. 6, this would result in freedom for all, and especially freedom for all religion, in keeping with the First Amendment. Point 7, and this Schaeffer leaves us with this: using this newfound freedom, Reformation Christianity would compete in the free marketplace of ideas without being subject to a hidden censorship. We must show it to be the truth, he says, by teaching, by life, and by action. Any questions?
Fire hose. So we have to replay it and admit it in our minds.
No rush. Hello, people. Hello out there in TV land. Yes, Bruce.
I think one of the issues is we are unable or unwilling to understand what the secular powers are that are arranged against us. I've been reading a book by Manifesto.
Well, I'll repeat the question, but.
Well, it's like disquisition.
Oh, he has Bruce has a disquisition for us. That's a really big word. And you see, this is why you get the guy who delivers auto parts to be your speaker, because I didn't use words like tendentious. I didn't use words like reify or inchoate. You know, you got gas station words from me. Yes, Bruce. Bruce is coming to offer his disquisition.
Well, it's just I listened to this. I mean, the thing that really sort of strikes me is I've been reading a book by I heard this man interviewed on Hugh Hewitt. His name is Ronald Pastritto, and he's a Hillsdale professor. He's with the Claremont Institute in California and so on. And he apparently is one of the leading experts in the history of the progressive movement in America. And I'll tell you, it's just one page of shocks after another. Going back into the late 1800s, right? There has been, well, first of all, there were a lot of people who didn't like the Constitution and didn't like the separation of powers and stuff like that from the very beginning. There was always that. But it began to become something which was identified as a real thing in, I guess, in the late 1800s. And people like Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, my God, and there's a man named Hubert Crowley, who was a famous writer.
Crowley, Ely,
And
ELY.
another guy who headed
John Dewey.
Johns Hopkins, good now, I think.
Okay.
And they Wilson used to say, don't read the first part of the Declaration of Independence, right? Don't read the stuff about God-given natural rights, right? Just read the Bill of Attainder against the king in the back, And they felt like, I mean, we have a saying in our house, he had an idea and it jumped on his horse and rode off in all directions. So things that can look good at the first can turn out to be something really bad. And so if you looked at the social and economic situation in the late 19th century, with sweatshops and child labor and all this sort of stuff, I mean, you think, well, there's lots of things that need to be fixed, and it's hard to get things through our Congress. So the solution is to fix our Congress, to tear up the thing, and you'll find professors from Berkeley and so on write books about this. Tear up the Constitution. We should have a constitutional convention at this point in our country. It's impossible. So this stuff has been. These are not things that just sort of showed up in the last 5 years, right? Some of these complaints about our society, they are deeply rooted in the progressive movement, and they will only be happy when the whole system is overthrown. No matter what they tell you, they will never tell you that, right? But it's really there. We need to get educated on this and understand what it is that we're facing. And so, I would say, for whatever else, just in deference to Jeffrey, whatever other flaws our current president has, I listen to him and I think we don't deserve him. We haven't operated enough to defend the things that need to be defended, and he's going out there and doing it, right? Right? And in his own sort of bull in a china shop sort of way, but that's all right. The courts have closed in on the executive and tried to sap it of its power, and he's pushing back. And so, of course, you're going to have lawsuits. I mean, half the things he does are generated to make lawsuits to try to clarify certain points of law to see whether you can make some running room so you can fire a few government employees. But it's really been interesting. It's called, look it up, Ron Prestritto, Pestritto. It's the history of American progressivism. That's not the title of the book. But it's really eye-opening, and you really won't come away thinking the same about what we think is the left and the progressive left and so forth in America.
Thank you. That was great. Hopefully everybody could hear that. Yes, Bruce, you're exactly right. And some of those people's ideas are still, current and read and promoted today. But yeah, the history of what's known as the progressive movement in America, capital P, capital M, going back to the 1920s and before, as you point out. Yeah, it's serious stuff. And Schaeffer does cover some of that in other of his books. For example, just little things like the Armory Show in 1915 in New York that had all this wild modern art that, of course, Christians back in Omaha weren't going to pay any attention to because it's not in New York and they're not hipsters and so on. But there were ideas being advanced in the artwork and in the art world of that time that needed to be thought through by thoughtful Christians, and it really just didn't happen. We were living in two separate zones. But yes, I would call all of our, in connection with what Bruce was saying, all of our attention to to what I consider a pretty magisterial work by Jonah Goldberg called Liberal Fascism, and he gives a history of the progressive movement and specifically shows its connections. You think, well, here's the progressives and here's the Nazis and never the 20. No, there was quite a lot of crossover. For example, eugenics. Eugenics was this huge thing. There's a local Atlanta lady pro-life lady who was one of the last few people to be involuntarily sterilized by the state of North Carolina about 1965, 66. Eugenics. So we're going to improve the human race, biologically. By just breeding and stuff. And it was totalitarian and the Nazis loved it, but where'd they get a lot of their content, their ideas, their documentation? They got it from America. They got it from us. They got it from our court decisions mediated by people like, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes and people like that, the 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. Let's sterilize these people,
Of course, he's influenced by Darwin.
Yes,
Yeah, Darwin.
yeah.
Was one of the progenitors.
But potentially, I mean, America, initially Thomas Jefferson initially was sympathetic to the French Revolution until he saw its totalitarian and rather ominous dark character to it. But America could have had a French Revolution, but we didn't because we had a more biblical, Schaeffer's going to argue we had a more biblical base. We had a lot more real living Christianity in us. And so like I get lost, Jeffrey is the historian. I get lost in the first Great Awakening and the second Great Awakening and Wesley and Whitefield and who did what and when. But I at least can rest in the knowledge that historians tell us that the reason that Britain didn't have some giant Russian Revolution and America didn't have such a thing was because of the gospel, ultimately. That's argued.
One particular thing of that is that, look at the difference between North America and South America. The people who came to North America came for God, many of them. The people who came for South America came for gold. And South America is still in a mess.
Yes. Yeah. Well, Walter Russell Mead wrote a book called God and Gold about the British Empire and all these things. And he mentions that there were literal mountains of silver in, places like Chile and Mexico and stuff. But what did the British find in the coasts of Carolina? A bunch of bleached tree trunks, So there's no silver here, there's no gold here, but what they did have was certain principles and ideas that, they're like security of property and things that South America has never really known. That, if you start a business, people can't just come and take it from you because they outvoted you or whatever. And these are, complicated things, but yeah, the progressive movement. And also what's interesting, especially when you start talking about Woodrow Wilson and some people down that line, is how racist it was. So the eugenics was a logical branch, and people like is it Ta-Nehisi Coates? There's people that there are black progressives today that just go, yeah, there was like this 50-year write-off of racist progressives, and they will be quite frank because they're black themselves. They will be quite frank about all the white racism in the historic progressive movement and stuff. So it's really very interesting in that regard. Other questions, comments?
Think that there was a tremendous amount of blood spilled, ink spilled in the late 19th century and early 20th to try to capture Abraham Lincoln as a hero of the progressive movement.
Mm.
Where did that come from, right? But their fundamental point was that Lincoln, because he fought against the states' rights secessionists in the South, was really a big government liberal, right? But there were lots of other reasons that they put it was not, and it doesn't match with anything he said or whatever, but they were, it's propaganda.
They also say,
Propaganda.
they say Lincoln's gay. Heard that right? That's
Oh, yeah. At least he was happy.
Listen. Oh, right.
Yeah, but Bruce is right. Of course, in the Spanish Civil War, all of the left wingers that went to Spain to fight, Stalin went and killed a lot of the moderate leftists and stuff. But anyway, people from Britain and America that went to Spain, they fought in what they still call the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. Now, military people I respect, and I'm not military, as Scott knows, but as military people tell me that there actually wasn't enough of them to make a brigade, that it really should be called the Abraham Lincoln Battalion. Well, I think it was bigger than a platoon. Scott.
I think it was point 6 of Schaeffer there at the end, you said that the task of something along the lines of the task of the church is to dislodge the current worldview. That was Schaeffer's idea.
Yeah, in the earlier part of in the earlier part of the book, he says we're to push back the worldview, and then later in the book he says we push back the results of the worldview.
never heard that articulated. Like, that is the task of the church, to do that. And I'm not saying that you're wrong, I'm saying, why haven't we heard that? You know, like, what are there organizations that are doing this? That's my next question. Like, who's doing this work of trying to actively take down the current worldview?
Well, funny you asked that, because actually our friend John West at the Discovery Institute is doing a lot to argue for intelligent design and argue that Darwinism, Darwin on trial.
I think Trump, even though he doesn't know what he's doing, I think at times, he's doing it, you know, in certain respects. But I wish we could, it's just a gap, I think, from churches to be able to say, this is our work, you know, let's actively engage in this. And take down the current worldview. I've just never heard that.
Well, we have, I think it's in the Bible, but it might not be always preached on. We have phrases like contend for the faith once delivered to the saints. We're told, shut the mouths of people who say this and that and the other thing. And it doesn't mean,
Not just, manage a decline or,
Scott is saying, if those who can't hear Scott online or elsewhere, Scott is saying that he's been in church half his life or more. And, what was the thing that, the guy on here, he's never heard the church say, this is our job, is to push back on this other worldview, defeat the worldview.
Because there's a political component.
Jeffrey's arguing that,
Church leaders are not about to get into that.
Jeffrey argues that because there's a political component, therefore they're not going to bring this up, that we have to push back on this world, this matter, this chance and matter materialist worldview.
A lot of worldviews, I would say there's an awful lot of worldviews that aren't political. Ultimate reality, the anthropology of man. I'm thinking make it political, but we think humans are fallen. We believe in original sin. Well, shouldn't be a political point.
Well, actually, Bruce is saying there's a lot of Christian doctrine that really isn't political that they could preach on and don't, if I'm reading Bruce correctly. But actually, Bruce is saying that things like just talking about the fall of man, that people are sinners, is not political. But actually, I actually heard about, there was one guy who was thrown in a Russian gulag, just a preacher who was preaching on original sin. And the Communist Party took the view that the Politburo, the nomenclatura, they took the view that, well, then in that case, the Communist Party is sinful. And so they jailed him for preaching on original sin. So you'd be surprised how far these things.
We've reached a point in our society that anything can be politicized.
Yes.
And that's the whole point of it.
Right.
So they can be used as something to fracture groups of people and break them up in smaller parts so that they can be controlled and
manipulated. Yes. I actually have an atheist friend who's politically quite left of center. And, everybody here is probably familiar with the Frank Turek book, Stealing from God, or at least that phenomenon. And that Schaeffer that was the basis of Schaeffer's apologetic, was to find the place where the unbeliever cheats and cannot get through his day successfully, cannot live as a complete whole person based on his own philosophy of life, but has to reach over and borrow concepts from Judeo-Christianity, from the Bible or Christian tradition, just to get through their day. And so I kept catching, well, I thought I kept catching my atheist friend doing that and borrowing meaning aspects of the meaning system of Christianity to even argue for his political points of view and stuff. So, well, that's unjust. And, Trump is I have another atheist friend who's like, Trump is an authoritarian and a crook. And it's like, so you're acknowledging that there's this overarching morality that's binding upon all of us. I didn't say any of that, you see what I'm saying? So anyway, so finally, after confronting and lovingly, I'd like to think it was loving confrontation because he still speaks to me, but my one of my atheist friends, I kept repeatedly confronting and trying to, push him into this corner where he would at least see that what I'm talking about, that what I'm dealing with. And so finally, late at night in a tavern, he said, okay, look, you believe that human rights exist, he said to me. I pretend they do, and we end up in the same place. And so, so you have a direct connection between philosophy and theology and politics and government and law. So yeah, our
very dishonest position. It's just existentialism. And that is, I'm going to pretend that my life has meaning and purpose.
Yes.
And, that there are certain values that I should promote.
It's true, but you can't, it's like you can't break through that with reason. Is that always something?
Well, you can point out their contradictions.
Yeah, you
their
can point out the
inherent
contradiction, it doesn't make any difference. That was not all.
We have we just have a few minutes left. If anybody online, if on the Zoom had questions, there would be voices coming out of this box. How does this work? Do they put their hand up in the chat? I don't have no idea how this works. Hello, people. Can you hear me? I'm giving a thumbs up. They can hear me. So I guess y'all have no questions or comments. I'm going to turn this back over to Jeffrey or Millie or whoever does these things at this point in time. God bless you all. To all a good night.
I think the Colson Conference fellows, I think they're trying to address this,
Oh.
equipping the lay people to be educated on what's going on in the world.
Very much
Go
so.
out and engage the culture.
Very much so.
The clergy, these are lay people.
Yes.
And that's us.
Yes, Millie's husband, Paul, has he's with the Colson organization or acts on their behalf locally as a representative. And so you too can become a Colson fellow. It costs about $1,000. It takes about a year and you go through about 15 books and discuss them with a cohort of people. And it's pretty great. I've not done it yet, but I'm trying to set aside time to take this on. And so if you want to be a Colson fellow, go there or at least go to the Colson Center's website. God bless you all. To all a good night.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Dan.
Thank you, sir.
Very good. And why do you think this book is so valuable and important?
Because
In less than 18 words.
of its continued relevance to us today.
Yeah, it speaks truth.
It's
And truth
wisdom.
is
It's wisdom.
timeless.
It's wisdom, yeah.
Yeah, okay. All right. Well, highly recommended, Christian Manifesto by Francis Schaeffer. All right, so next week, let's see, remind me what's coming up next week.
Scott Davis here.
Yeah. And Scott, why don't you come up for just a second and let us know what you're going to be talking about next week, and we'll close things out.
Okay. Yep, I'm just going to be talking about The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind by Mark Knoll. That's the next book up. And we'll be talking about really the history of evangelicalism and how that's affected how we think. So that's really, it's been great study. I'm looking forward to presenting. So,
Yeah, thank you.
yeah.
All right. All right, well, good evening. Nice being with you all. Thank you, Dan, again.
Okay.
Those of you joining us online, great to see you. And again, tomorrow night at Mount Bethel, join us for our Areopagus Forum, 6:30.
Absolutely.